The Kansas sun beat down on the dry earth, baking the soil until it cracked. A young woman stood alone in the middle of a vast cornfield, wiping sweat from her forehead with a dirty glove. She heard the truck before she saw it. It was a heavy, grinding roar, getting louder with every second, kicking up a cloud of dust that swallowed the horizon. She gripped the handle of her hoe tight enough to turn her knuckles white. The truck crested the hill and screeched to a halt right at the edge of her property. The back gate dropped with a heavy metallic clang. Men began to jump out, one by one. They wore faded uniforms that didn't belong in America. They wore caps with insignias that her husband was currently shooting at across the ocean. There were 20 of them, and there was only one guard, a bored-looking teenager with a shotgun resting casually on his shoulder. One of the men stepped forward, picking up a machete from the tool pile. He tested the weight of the blade in his hand. He looked at the field. Then he looked directly at her. The enemy was no longer a headline in the newspaper. The enemy was standing 10 feet away, holding a weapon, on her family farm. It was 1943, and the United States faced a crisis that threatened to starve the nation. Millions of able-bodied men had left the fields to fight in Europe and the Pacific. Crops were rotting on the vine. Factories were desperate for hands. The government came up with a solution that sounded like madness to the average citizen. Bring the prisoners of war to the American heartland. By the end of the conflict, over 400,000 German soldiers would be housed on American soil. They weren't just locked in cells. They were put to work. If you enjoy uncovering the hidden chapters of history that textbooks often leave out, take a second to subscribe. We are digging up stories that time almost forgot. For Mary, a farmer's wife in rural Kansas, the geopolitics didn't matter. All she knew was that her husband, John, was somewhere in Italy. And the men now standing in her cornfield were wearing the same uniform as the men trying to kill him. She felt a cold knot in her stomach that the summer heat couldn't touch. The air smelled of diesel fumes and dry stalks. The guard, a boy named Billy, who couldn't have been more than 17, spat on the ground. He gestured vaguely at the prisoners. "They're all yours, Mrs. Miller," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Just point 'em where you need the work done." Mary looked at the group. They were younger than she expected. Some were barely out of their teens, sun-bleached hair and blue eyes, looking more like local farm boys than the monsters she heard about on the radio. But the insignia on their collars was real. "Don't take your eyes off them," Mary said. Billy shrugged, shifting the shotgun. "They ain't going nowhere, ma'am." "Too much ocean between here and Berlin." The prisoners stood in a loose formation, waiting. They didn't look defiant. They looked hungry. One of them, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, stepped closer to the water barrel. Mary flinched. He paused, his hand hovering over the ladle. He looked at her, waiting for permission. It was a small gesture, but it threw her off balance. She nodded sharply. He drank, the water spilling down his chin, and wiped it with a ragged sleeve. Then he picked up a corn knife. The sound of 20 blades slicing into the air began. It was a rhythmic, hacking sound that echoed across the empty plains. Mary watched from the porch, her hand resting on the hidden pistol in her apron pocket. According to her diary from that week, the fear was physical. She wrote, "I watched them work my land. I kept thinking, if John was captured, would their wives give him water? Or would they let him thirst? The days turned into weeks. The tension never fully left, but it changed shape. The men worked hard, harder than the hired hands she used to employ before the war. They moved with military precision, clearing acres in half the time she expected. They didn't speak much to her, just low murmurs in German among themselves. But the silence was broken one Tuesday afternoon. The old tractor, a rusting beast that was holding the farm together, sputtered and died. Smoke poured from the engine block, black and oily. Mary ran over, coughing, waving the smoke away. She kicked the tire in frustration. Without that tractor, the harvest wouldn't make it to the train depot on time. She was done. She sat on the wheel hub, burying her face in her hands. She didn't hear the footsteps approaching through the tall grass. A shadow fell over her. She looked up. It was the prisoner with the scar. He was standing too close. Billy, the guard, was dozing under a tree 50 yards away, his hat pulled over his eyes. If this man wanted to hurt her, he could do it right now. He held a wrench in his hand. Mary's hand went to her pocket, gripping the cold steel of her pistol. "Get back," she warned. The man didn't move back. He pointed at the engine with the wrench. "Carburetor," he said. The word was thick with an accent, but clear. Mary stared at him. "What?" "Carburetor is clogged," he said, searching for the words. "I fix." "You're a mechanic?" "In Hamburg. Before." He gestured to his uniform. "I fix cars." Mary looked at the guard, asleep. She looked at the smoking engine. She looked at the enemy soldier offering to save her livelihood. "Do it," she whispered. He went to work. His hands were covered in grease within seconds. He moved with a confidence that calmed her. He wasn't a soldier in that moment. He was just a man trying to make a machine run. 20 minutes later, the engine roared to life. He wiped his hands on a rag and looked at her. For the first time, he smiled. It was a tired, genuine smile. "Good machine," he said. "Thank you," Mary said, and she realized she meant it. "My name is Mary." He nodded formally. "Heinrich." That night, Mary sat at her kitchen table. The house was quiet. She opened her diary again. She wrote, "Today I forgot to hate them. I don't know if that makes me a traitor or just a human being. Heinrich showed me a picture of his daughter. She looks just like my niece." But the war was not just mechanics and cornfields. It was unpredictable. October brought the storms. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the wind began to howl, tearing at the shingles of the barn. The radio warned of a tornado watch. The harvest was cut, but it was still in the fields, stacked in piles. If the rain hit it before they got it into the barn, the crop would rot. A year of work would be gone. Mary ran out onto the porch. The wind nearly knocked her over. The prisoners were huddled near the truck, waiting for the order to leave. Billy was yelling at them to get in. They were leaving. They were going back to the safety of the camp. Mary stood in the driveway, watching the truck engine idle. She looked at the field. She looked at the darkening sky. She was going to lose everything. Suddenly, a figure jumped down from the back of the truck. It was Heinrich. Then another man jumped down. Then 2 more. Billy shouted, waving his shotgun, "Get back in the truck! We're moving out!" Heinrich ignored him. He looked at Mary, rain starting to spot his dusty tunic. "We load," he shouted over the wind. "It's not your crop," Billy yelled. "It's not your problem." Heinrich turned to the guard. "It is food," he said simply. "We do not waste food." He ran toward the barn. The other prisoners followed him. Billy stood there, stunned, lower lip trembling, unsure whether to shoot or help. He lowered the gun and ran after them. Mary didn't wait. She ran into the field. It became a chaotic ballet of desperation. The rain began to fall in sheets, cold and stinging. Lightning flashed, illuminating the German soldiers running back and forth with heavy bundles of corn. They formed a human chain. Pass, grab, throw, run. Mud splashed over their boots and uniforms. Mary was in the line with them, passing bundles to a man who had sworn allegiance to the Third Reich. He passed them to Billy, the American guard. There were no sides in the storm. There was only the crop and the coming winter. Heinrich was shouting orders in German, organizing the men, pointing to the weak spots in the line. He wasn't acting like a prisoner. He was a sergeant again, commanding his squad. But this time, the mission was creation, not destruction. Mary slipped in the mud, going down hard on her knee. A hand grabbed her arm instantly. She looked up into blue eyes. "Up, Mary. Schnell. Move." He pulled her to her feet and shoved a bundle of corn into her arms. "Go." They worked until their muscles burned, and their lungs felt like they were bleeding. The barn doors slammed shut, just as the hail began to pound the roof like machine gun fire. Inside, it was dark and smelled of damp wool and sweet corn. 22 people stood in the shadows, chests heaving, gasping for air. The silence stretched out. Billy clicked his flashlight on. The beam cut through the dust. It landed on Heinrich, who was leaning against a wooden post, wiping mud from his face. Billy didn't raise his shotgun. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a pack of cigarettes. He walked over to Heinrich. He offered him one. Heinrich took it with a nod. "Danke." Billy lit it for him. "You guys are crazy," Billy said, shaking his head. "We are farmers," Heinrich replied, exhaling a cloud of smoke. "Farmers know." The storm raged outside, but inside, the war felt 1,000 miles away. By the time the truck finally left that evening, the crop was safe. Mary stood on the porch, watching the taillights fade into the darkness. She never saw Heinrich again after that season. The war ended 2 years later. The camps were emptied. The men were shipped back to a broken Europe to rebuild their own lives. But the impact of those years remained. According to official U.S. Army reports, German POWs contributed over 20 million man-hours of labor to American agriculture and industry. They saved the tomato harvest in Indiana. They cut pulpwood in the forests of Maine. They picked cotton in Texas. Many farmers admitted that without the enemy, the country would have gone hungry. Years later, letters started arriving at farmhouses across America. They came from Germany. They were written in broken English. They weren't hateful. They were letters of gratitude. Some former prisoners even immigrated back to the United States years later, buying land near the very farms where they had been held captive. Mary kept the wrench Heinrich had used. It sat on her mantle for 40 years. If you want to see more stories about the human side of history, make sure you're subscribed. We bring the past back to life. War is often painted in black and white. Good and evil. Us and them. But on a stormy afternoon in Kansas, the line blurred. Sometimes The person you are told to hate is the only one who can help you save what matters. War creates enemies, but labor creates men.